Hey, I want to jump in on that. Okay, what you said is great if that were truly the neo-apologist strategy. Don't look here, on this. Well, for instance, and I got to say this, and then I wanted to loop back to your earlier comment. Adam Miller and that Buddhist story is completely different from what you're saying here.
Okay.
It's skillful means is what it's the term in Buddhism that says, does this help you towards enlightenment or does it help you towards enlightenment? You're focusing on the wrong thing. You want to know all these other things. Look, enlightenment is realizing I got to get rid of this arrow. I got to get rid of my craving.
Adam Miller believes that enlightenment is looking towards Buddhism instead of towards the general authorities.
Well, I don't know about that. But where you have Adam saying things like, Mormonism really points beyond Mormonism. All religion really does that. I even did a podcast on Mormon matters called A Mormonism That Looks Beyond Itself. And I think pretty much everybody here would say, if there's such a thing as salvation, it isn't because of a set of beliefs. It's easy to believe or not believe and all that stuff. It's, who did you become? It's not like, did you do all these things to get to the celestial kingdom? It's, who did you become? Are you able to be a celestial person? I think everybody agrees with that. They just don't think of it all the time. So I don't want to think that Adam or mostly neo-apologetics, neo-apologists are saying, don't look over here.
But they are, and this is why I'll say that they are. They don't express that, but their refusal to engage directly in public with certain intractable issues, it shows, I think, what basket their eggs are in. And so on the first part of this interview, when John, I don't know if we want to use the word accused of Patrick and whoever else of having quote unquote secret meetings, where we're trying to convince people to stay in the church. And they said, well, it wasn't a secret meeting or, whatever. And I would say, well, it's certainly not open to the public. So maybe it's not secret, but it is private. And there are lots of examples of this, whether like I heard, again, because it wasn't widely publicized, because people are not supposed to bring attention to themselves as charismatic individuals that are not part of the hierarchy, because you get in trouble for that. But I heard that several years ago, I forget where, in Utah County, maybe, that, like Terrell Givens was inviting people who were not strongly in or strongly out, but just questioning and doubting, and that they could, and I didn't know how you got an invitation to that. I just finished editing a transcription of Grant Palmer's first Mormon Stories interview, where he talks about Richard Bushman doing similar things for missionaries in New England. I don't know the extent of these things, but that's my point. The extent of these things is not known because we do not want to shine bright lights on them. We want to handle this, to use a separate analogy, not moving away from vehicles and into buildings. I was talking to John Hamer about this, and I hope he doesn't mind that I'm stealing it from him, but he talks about the church as a building, and the facade looks all right, but it's been a number of years and things are breaking on the inside, and there are different ways to respond to this. I think the traditional apologetic response would be to say, look, there's not necessarily something wrong here, and we need to just build up the outer wall so that we're protected against attacks. External attacks. Another response would be, and I feel personally that the CES letter or things like that veer in this direction, where it says, well, we just need to demolish the whole thing, load it up with C4 and hit ignite. Another response is what I consider to be the maybe more neo-apologetic response is, okay, we are going to go inside the building, us, trained professionals, and we're going to fix things, but we're going to do it in a way that is very careful and fairly quiet. And we're going to do it because there are people in the building that don't know these problems exist, and we don't want to upset them. And upsetting them would get in the way of our work. And so we're going to do that. And then there's another response which says, look, the building is condemned. There are serious problems, but we're not just going to blow it up. Why don't we use the bricks to build something new? And I feel more sympathetic with that approach, but I recognize that the different people in the different remodel camps, I guess, they have reasons for doing what they're doing, and we have reasons to be critical of each other.
Hey, I love what you're saying. Let me, yeah, the secret, all that stuff. I don't know what it is, because I think of temperament, and whether you're an activist temperament or whether you're a a person able to do it. When you said earlier, and I think this ties what you just said now too. You says you can't fault folks for making the decision because this is the way it was presented to them, and da da da, and there is no faulting, and I agree with that, 100%. But what neo-apologists are doing, at least that you haven't mentioned, what I think I'm doing, whether I'm a neo-apologist or not, John can.
And I don't count you as
no, yeah,
then,
but I think I'm doing is more like speaking from, and even I think these meetings with the Bushmans and the Givenses going around, I think what they're trying to do and say is, yes, you're not at fault for having these reactions. Honor your emotions. These are valid. These are everything you're saying you have every right to feel. But it's by saying, in a broader context, as you move forward, in a broader context, just like it took Loyd years to kind of go through these things, and he wasn't as sudden. And you said within 3 years, yours was kind of a little bit quicker. Mine was over 11 year, kind of learning to make peace or something like that. I think what we're doing is not trying again to don't look over here, look over here, or we're not just trying to I hope nobody else notices it. But our work, because we're speaking from these perspectives that are both and, or however you want to say it, conjunctive faith type perspectives, we're just trying to model and to be there as guides on the hero's journey, as the mentor or somebody who is ready to take it. And we're trying to destigmatize the problem of being called out of your naivete. We're trying to say this is the human journey. This is what every religion is pointing to. Go and get it yourself. Get the elixir of life, and then still be in your community afterwards, but you're the master of both worlds. You're able to understand inside the myth as well as outside the myth, and you can handle not being triggered, by people who are still at the literal stages. So that's where I would want to throw in there.
I think to add to Bert's analogy, or actually John Hammer's analogy, is I think you have to also add that there are people in the building, right? So if you C4 the building, if you tear it down, there's going to be casualties, right? And so I think I hate the term neo-apologist, but let's run with it. Right? The neo-apologists are recognizing, hey, there's people in here that find shelter, that find peace, that find protection from the elements, all these sorts of things within this building. And so if we just blow the thing up, it's gone. Right. And they perhaps themselves find shelter in it. Right. So they want to maintain it. They want to keep it going. But I think you touched on this, Bert, is there's risks, right? They have to, in some ways, kind of keep it secret. When it's by secret or small, it's a tough. They've got to walk on a very thin wire as they're doing this, right? And this is exemplified perfectly by Dwayne Boyce's recent attacks on the Interpreter on Givens and Hardy and others, right? Where it's like, hey, how dare you say that there's any false in here? You're completely wrong. Like, you are a threat. You're the inside, right? This is Ralph Hancock as well with Adam Miller and others, right? Yep. Portraying them as the enemy by trying to say, hey, look, it's complicated. There's more issues than we're willing to recognize. And so in order for them to fix the buildings, they see themselves doing it, they have to do it carefully. They can't just come out and say, yes, church leaders are infallible. Because you make that explicit, the people that your efforts to try to fix a building, you'll be exiled out, right? So they've got to play a very fine line in order to try to fix that which they love, right? I mean, that's why a lot of buildings, we don't just tear down the building, rebuild them. We say, here's a building that we care about. Let's fix it. We have to go in there and do it very carefully, like the Provo Tabernacle, for example. Right. So they're trying to turn the burned down Provo Tabernacle into a temple.
Right. And I will admit the necessity of when you try to make change, you need pressures both internal and external. And when it comes to, because I think me and a lot of folks that I criticize want very similar things. And what we disagree is not what we want, but how to get it. So it's a discussion of tactics. And I think that because we disagree, we will possibly in the future critique each other. But one of my critiques is that if you're in a situation that's as precarious as that, and it is that precarious, I know people personally that if they spoke their mind, they'd lose their employment, their retirement, their benefits. And it is that precarious. For me, that is an argument against preservation of the building and an argument for using old materials to make a new building. But I also recognize that what I'm saying is my opinion. It's not based in some sort of population study or repeatable experiment or in a well-argued thesis with logical coherence. I recognize that. It's my opinion. But I think that there are other people with this opinion as well. And
I agree.
Speak for it. Mm-hmm.
But you certainly agree that C4ing the building it's easier to say C4 the building because you're not inside it, and
I think that's a huge problem.
And you're not necessarily concerned with keeping the structure itself.
Of course, that's a huge problem. And look, I recognize as well that the larger context for the precarity of the situation is that each person's individual life is highly precarious. That you risk that every day that you are alive and that you are breathing and that you are healthy seems to me a lucky day. And it's hard to see it that way sometimes because it's something that can be taken for granted. And so I recognize that the strategy of just blowing things up is not helpful, because what are you going to do once you throw bombs at the church? Where are you going to go next? Are you going to throw bombs at your family? Are you going to throw bombs at your employer or your employees? Are you going to throw bombs on other things that you've cherished? And so I do recognize the maybe the false start that can create. So
loving it. John, do you want to do some steering? We're at the 2-hour mark.
Yeah.
I don't know what
I love everyone's perspective today. I appreciate you guys trying to go with me on the car analogy. Every analogy is wrong or incomplete or unsatisfactory in a sense. And so it's an act of vulnerability to even try and lay one out there, but it's for the sake of trying to structure the discussion. And so I appreciate the extent to which, you guys are willing to go along with that. While you guys were talking, I tried to kind of distill my thoughts as it relates to apologetics specifically, because I do hear the audience, the believers in the audience that are like, yeah, John, we get it. We're sick of your rants. And then of course, I'm also aware that a lot of the ex-Mormons are like, you go get him, John. And then in some sense that doesn't help, right? That doesn't get us anywhere better. So what I try to do is distill my thoughts, and let me just lay out how I'll summarize sort of how the analogy, how apologetics, how the past and the present and the future kind of maybe all fit together for me. For anyone who is a Mormon church leader or someone who speaks out publicly about these problems, here's what I would say needs to happen. This is what and then I've got some critiques for non-believers and critics as well. So here it is. Number one, I think that it's everyone's job to become informed, whether it's, and this is going to be stating the obvious, but whether it's the Mormon church leaders, the apostles, the GAs, bishops, whoever, I think members, I do think we all have this obligation to become as informed as possible about what we're a part of. But in some sense, no man knows my history has been around since 1945. Like, a lot of the stuff that's come out really doesn't shed any more light than that book itself. And so you'd have to ask, well, if that information's been out there for so long, why don't we all know it? And I think it's because of problems within the system. And so here are the problems within the system that I think need to stop, either at the church leadership level or with apologists. So the first thing that needs to happen is that people need to become informed. The second thing is that victims of when the church does cause harm, victims need to stop being blamed, and they need to stop being gaslighted. So examples would be when we say that non-believers were weak, or they were just offended or looking to sin. That's a problem. Or when apologists say, well, there was that one Ensign article about peepstones back in 1982. You should have seen that and read it. That's bad, whether apologists or church leaders do it. When victims are blamed, or when they're gaslighted and told these aren't problems, that's not good. Then anytime a critic speaks up about the problem and they're maligned or punished, that needs to stop. So whether apologists, old school apologists, or people on the internet now want to take down Jeremy Runnels or me or anyone else for just speaking openly about the problems, or when the church excommunicates or punishes people for talking openly about the problems, or censures them, takes away their temple recommend, or keeps them from being able to attend a wedding or a baptism or whatever, or perform an ordinance, that's wrong. The next thing that's wrong is anytime problems are hidden or denied, or people are distracted from them. And so, of course, when Joseph Fielding Smith rips out the page in the book that talks about an alternative version of the first vision, that's wrong. But also when apologists counter the critics with any sort of information that would either deny or distract what's going on. So an example would be, someone trying to come up with an excuse that basically says that all the first vision accounts are consistent, or Joseph Smith didn't have sex with his polyandrous or underage wives. To me, that feels like either trying to deny that there was a problem, or even when Terrell Givens or someone offers poetry or prose or beautiful metaphors that really don't address the problems, but instead sort of say, don't look over here at the problems, look over here at the beauty. Anytime an apologist or a church leader does a move that would deny or distract people from the problems, for me, that's a problem. The problems need to be openly acknowledged, and then an apology needs to be made. The church has not, we start with the problem that Elder Oaks has said, we don't make apologies. But even so, the church at some point needs to apologize for what's happened. The leaders need to apologize. The church needs to follow its own recommendations for repentance and acknowledge that the problems are happening, that they have happened, and apologize for them. And this puts apologists in a really tough spot, because in some sense, they're not really apologizing, but they're trying to make excuses or make things right or encourage continued loyalty when an apology should have been made and hasn't been made. The next step is that everything needs to be done to fix the problems, and to make restitution. And again, this is something that apologists are actively trying to do, and I give them credit, whether they're working on making the essays come out, or they're going around in firesides to try and speak as candidly and openly as possible. That's all good. I think apologists are often doing good things there and trying to be constructive parts of the solution. And it's not ultimately theirs to make the restitution, but they're anxiously engaging in attempts to make things right. And I do give them credit for that. Here's the final points about neo-apologists that I think are of concern, is that sometimes they're not willing to just be completely candid about the problems and just say, Joseph Smith's polygamy was irresponsible, or the Book of Abraham is not historical, or the Book of Mormon is just simply not historical. A lot of apologists don't want to get in trouble. They're managing their capital, and so they don't do often the job that they really should to be a part of acknowledging the problems that are out there. And that's something that I would just like to see neo-apologists just be more candid about it. It seems like so many neo-apologists, they're scared of losing their seat, their endowed chair at the university that's funded by believing Mormons. They're scared of getting in trouble.
They're rightly scared.
Yeah.
They're rightly scared.
Yeah. Or they're scared of being disciplined like me or Jeremy Runnels or other people. And so they're shy about being a part of the full disclosure that needs to happen. And if what they do instead is basically people walk away saying, well, I listened to Terrell Gibbons, I listened to Fiona, I listened to Richard. They basically said, stick with the church because it's good. Stick with the church because it makes you feel good. Stick with the church because it has a great community. But they haven't become in that process fully aware of the problems. Then what I worry that neo-apologists do that's unethical is they've basically bolstered the authority of the brethren, and they've bolstered people's ongoing willingness to be obedient to the church and to expose themselves to continued and future risk without being fully informed of the problems. And I know it's tricky. I know it's tricky.
It's not their intent to do that, John. That's where it's just the intent that
this is where Dan and I agree. Dan thinks that, as I understand, that intent is essential, and I don't. Because I think that people can intend the best and still end up with poor results where, you have the collateral damage, like Phillips talks about, I think. And so I'm not as centered in intent as, and maybe, Dan, tell me if I'm right, but maybe this is just a deep point of disagreement between you and me.
When we talk about intent, do you mean neo-apologists or church leaders, Dan?
Let me get my button on. I was thinking neo-apologists right then.
Okay, I did. I'm
not
saying that
around. It's like they're not being candid enough and not saying, well, it's not historical and stuff like that. Well, that implies to me that in your mind they believe that it's not historical, or they think this is a subtle question. So for me, for instance, I'm like 95% certain that it's not historical, that Nephi and Lehi never lived, but I still have an open question because of internal evidences from the Book of Mormon that seem to me that would read like a person who was an abridger, leaving in certain parts and taking out certain parts. And there's these amazing little, like, whoa, why would that occur to Joseph Smith at this point? Where it would see that Mormon would go, dang, I never wrote before about how Nephi is Alma's brother, so I've got to explain why Alma isn't given the plates to his brother. It's because he died. And this is like, I mean, I got to think that if I were a neo-apologist and I was going around there, I wouldn't be hiding that, or not being candid enough.
And I want to bolster Dan's claim that I have total conviction that Joseph Spencer believes the Book of Mormon is historical, but that he doesn't worry about it too much. That Grant and Heather Hardy believe that the Book of Mormon is historical. That Richard Bushman does. That, I don't know that Claudia Bushman does, but you just have to ask her. That Terrell does. So I really do think that these people believe these things. However, the problem is that it's like when you're speaking from a position of academic or scholarly or intellectual authority, and you represent a minority position. Now, they represent a majority religious position, but I'm a minority intellectual position, because the overwhelming academic consensus is that the Book of Mormon is not what it claims to be, that the Book of Abraham is not what it claims to be. For anybody that looks into these things, even, superficially, this is the overwhelming academic consensus. And so for them to present a minority position and to bolster it with their beliefs and their claims is fine. They have every right to do it. But I think what, John, you might be pointing to is the fact that they are doing so with their intellectual or scholarly authority, and yet do not present all the other plausible positions. I think that is where the intellectual potential dishonesty comes in. And this is a really dangerous rhetorical move to make, but I'll give it a shot anyways, is that there are scientists, legitimate Nobel Prize winning scientists that deny climate change. Okay? And so it seems to me irresponsible for them to not be able to express their opinion. They're more than welcome to. It also seems irresponsible for them to not address their critics. When it seems like critics have legitimate responses to their unusual claims. So,
yeah, but it would take 4-hour or at least half-day workshops to really do what you're calling for instead of a 1-hour fireside, you know. So,
well, a couple quick responses. Dan, I'm not sitting here saying that anyone's being intentionally misleading or duplicitous. So, I guess what I'm saying is maybe a couple things. One is that we all there is a level to which I think thoughtful people can look at the Book of Abraham, for example, and we all know that it's not what Joseph claimed it was. I think the fact that the word Abraham doesn't show up anywhere in that scroll, in that papyrus, you know, it's pretty much undeniable by anyone who's willing to be even an attempt at objectivity, to agree that is not what Joseph claimed it was, that he claimed to translate the papyri and he didn't. And so that's something that attempting to sort of make some colorful artistic explanation for where somehow the papyrus inspired him to channel God's will. What I'm saying is that's a problematic act. I think it's done with good intent, but I think it's basically denying what's pretty clearly objective reality. And then the move of trying to come up with some explanation is basically what it does is it lets a believer who is still staring the potential harm at the face, and they're not really aware that harm could be coming. It's basically saying to them, in effect, don't worry, everything's fine. Stay in the car, stay in the boat, which is what many general authorities say. Everything's fine. When in reality, what should be said is, by Gibbons, by Bushman, by everyone, it should say, hey, we should just all admit that Joseph claimed to translate a papyri and he didn't. And it's wrong. And that should be a piece of information that everyone knows about, right? Because it's pretty much objective fact, and it's pretty important piece of information that should inform whether someone decides to be faithful and obedient to the brethren or not. And so anytime an apologetic response either doesn't acknowledge something like that, or tries to get people to not worry about that problem, but instead think of an artistic, philosophical, or even a metaphysical alternative to the problem, is in some ways empowering the brethren and reinforcing people's obedience to the brethren, potentially to their own harm. Does that not make sense at all?
I've got a few responses here, and they're all tied together. One, when you're talking about objective fact, I think you're saying far more than you're able to know, right? And this is revealed in a couple of things. One, I just want to call you out and say you keep saying you're not trying to imply deception, but you are, right? You constantly refer to use rhetoric that implies deception, right? When you say that converts are being sold a message, you're implying deception there, right? And just you are, right? And,
no. When a missionary,
but you're implying that you're saying that there is deception at some level in institutional church.
But let me be clear. No, I'm not saying that Thomas S. Monson is trying to deceive people. I think he believes it's true. I think the missionary teaching it believes it's true. So the only one that could have perpetuated a deception in that case is Joseph Smith himself. And I've acknowledged, I think that Joseph Smith probably was a deceiver and probably was a charlatan on some levels. But I don't think that the modern missionary, the modern mission president, the modern general authorities are necessarily intentionally trying to deceive people. No, I don't think that.
You're clear on that, but you are completely ignoring arguments by that Charlie Harrell has laid out and stuff about the nature of revelation and where do you start, where does God end, you know, this idea of Joseph Smith as a charlatan, even though you say it's evidentially obvious, well, you didn't quite make it that strong a claim, but I still think it's very legitimate to not claim that. I've had enough spiritual experiences, and it's only as I've grown and moved on that I realize how much of those things were content from me. And yet I still can't deny the power of that experience.
And this brings you to my third point that I want to address, and this is one on your list of points you're bringing up. You said that apologists or Mormon scholars, whatever, shouldn't bring up evidence, and you use that denies or distracts away from criticisms, right? The distracts, I'm on board with you, right? You shouldn't just, you know, throw out a red herring and say, hey, look over here, you know, move away, don't look behind the curtain, right? But when you say that they shouldn't bring up evidence that denies the criticism, right, you're implying, right, you're rejecting scholarship, right? You're saying, hey, this view is established, this is objective fact, and now you cannot show me anything, or how dare you try to say that this objective fact isn't the case, right? So for example, right, some critic might say, look, you know, Joseph Smith was married to Helen Mar Kimball this young age, or sealed to her, you know, and that's all loaded with this notion of, right, that he was having sex with this 14-year-old. Now, what if a scholar, you know, such as Brian Hales or somebody, any kind of scholar, said, look, I have strong evidence that this was a non-sexual relationship, right? I have strong evidence that denies the claim that you are making. And you just said, well, no, how dare you bring up evidence that denies that, right? Now, and this ties into my chapter, my paper, because I would say a scholar, as a historian, if they have evidence, right, they've got a good reason to make a strong case that goes against it. Yeah, like as a scholar, they have that obligation, perhaps, to do so, right? And you should be saying they shouldn't be doing that. But my criticism, my point would be to say, yes, they might have to do that, but they shouldn't do that implying that it says anything about Joseph Smith being a prophet, right? And so, yeah, if they have evidence that Joseph Smith wasn't having sex with Helen Mar Kimball, bring it forth, but don't pretend that means, therefore, I have defended Joseph Smith as a prophet of God.
The challenge I have with that part of your argument, Loyd, is if John Dehlin in 2017 did the things that Joseph did, made the claims that Joseph made, whether it was claimed to translate the papyra or produced a book with all the anachronisms in it, or propositioned people's wives, or you know, made sexual advances on so many people would eviscerate me. They would probably put me in jail. They would probably potentially try and harm me physically or even kill me, right? But that same standard that you guys would likely apply to me if I made the claims that Joseph made today, you're not willing to hold Joseph to that same standard necessarily. And so for me, if Joseph is propositioning people's wives, potentially sleeping with underage girls, claiming to manufacture scripture that it turns out it really wasn't translations as he claimed, that does speak to whether or not he was God's prophet on the earth. And I don't understand why it shouldn't, Loyd.
I don't even know how to respond to that. That's ridiculous. I don't even know where you're coming with that accusation from.
What do you mean?
Where have I said there's a double standard?
No, I'm saying, why shouldn't, it seems like you're saying whether or not Joseph was a prophet of God has nothing to do with all the things that he did in his life.
Yeah, I'm saying that.
Yeah, he is saying that. Yeah.
And I agree
with that claim.
I'm saying maybe he should have been in jail.
Yeah.
Right? And so if he did those things, perhaps he should have been in prison. But I'm saying, right, and this is the point I made in my paper, right, is we've got these beautiful Psalms, right, that are traditionally written by a guy who raped someone, got her pregnant, and then killed off her husband to protect it, right? It doesn't mean that people who do horrible things can come up, it could bring forth something beautiful at the same time.
I think, okay, if I may.
But my point, going back to what I was criticizing you for, is you're assuming that all of these things are the case. And I'm just saying, look, if a historian says, look, I have good reason to believe that the accusation you're making didn't actually happen, then that's a discussion that should happen. You seem to be saying, no, they shouldn't even bring up evidence that counters your criticism in the first place.
No,
because it's objective fact.
No, and this is where there's a difference between scholarship and boots on the ground. Because everyone should write all the papers that they can write, publish all the books that they can publish, do all the research that they can do. What I'm talking about is when Givens or Bushman or Mason go to the wards and go to the firesides, and members are going there saying, I'm having this really big crisis of faith. I don't know what to do. Help me, right? Then it's when these principles apply. I think the ethical and reasonable thing to do is to say, let's just stipulate people in this chapel that are here to see me, Terrell Givens. I want to start by saying there are a ton of legitimate problems. And you acknowledge them. You say, here are the problems that are legitimate. The Book of Abraham likely isn't a translation. The Book of Mormon has all these anachronistic and genetic and archaeological problems that seriously question its authenticity as a historical book. It's racist. The Brethren have been racist. The temple ceremony was largely borrowed from Masonic ritual. Let's just acknowledge the problems, the LGBT suicide rates. That's all. Let's start by saying this is all the stuff that's legitimate. I, as Terrell Givens, or I, as Richard Bushman, I acknowledge those problems. Now, having informed you of the legitimate problems and acknowledged that they're problems, now I'll end by saying, here's how I deal with these things. And if they wanted to inject scholarship or personal opinion or a more practical response about how the church still edifies me, or it's a great place for spiritual pursuits or whatever, that's fine. But to not speak openly and boldly and directly and candidly about the former, and just to do the latter, which is, I'm not going to talk about the problems, but let's just talk about the beautiful things about the church so that you keep paying your tithing, so that you keep being obedient, so that you keep following the brethren. For me, I'm not saying they're intentionally misleading people, but there's an ethical problem there in perpetuating the obedience and the devotion and even the literalistic beliefs without educating about the problems and the dangers and being very explicit about it.
And if I could say, the way that you listed the problems, John, was highly tendentious, saying, the Book of Abraham probably is not a translation the way Joseph claimed it is, and so on and so forth. And if I could just, because I think what you're saying is fair, but just back it up a little bit and say, hey, look, there is a problem with the Book of Abraham. And these are the sides of the debate, or these are the different concerns. And I am not going to tell you what to believe about this.
That's fine.
But part of that is the fact of what you just said, right? Like the Book of Abraham, there's a high probability that it's not what Joseph claimed it to be, and here are the reasons why. And if they want to say at the end of that, now that's not what I believe, but those are valid concerns that a person can bring to the table. And I would guess that a lot of the people that go to these different groups are not just themselves experiencing faith crises or transition, but they have family members or close friends who are. And so I feel like if the thrust is to give an answer before acknowledging the problem, then they're actually doing a disservice to the people that show up to these things, who will be unable to dialogue with their close friends or family members about the difficulties that they're having, which is my critique of Planted, because it seems like that book was written for two audiences: one, people who are struggling, and people who know someone who's struggling. But I felt like in terms of talking to people who are struggling, it definitely moved the needle in a positive direction, but it didn't really get at the concerns that people have. And so if they are concerned about people staying in the boat, whether that's the individuals in attendance themselves or close friends or family members, one of the first things they should say is, hey, you want to know what these problems are and you're concerned about a family member, ask that family member, right? And see what the problems are as they perceive them. And I think that would be a more appropriate response. But going back to the idea of, I think, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, John, but I think that Loyd is right to point out that you're implying deception on some level, and I have no problem with that implication. I would even claim it. I would claim there is deception on multiple levels, and so I hope that that's okay, that we can talk in that way. And if somebody wants to come back and say, no, Bert Fuller, you're the liar, I would say, okay, like, you're welcome to claim that. And if somebody is concerned about me being a liar, then they can look at my stuff, or they can tell falsehoods, and they're free to do so. I'm not claiming to know things for them, I feel.
That was terrific. And you're starting to have a little bit of internet problems there, Bert. You're kind of pausing and stuff.
Okay.
Just quickly, let me just add this piece again. These firesides aren't for what you're saying they are. They're pastoral exercises. And for me, the pastoring that's involved, and I think by these people being there and from the self-selected audiences that are there, there is already in front of them somebody that acknowledges problems. He or she doesn't need to spell them all out and take that half hour. Well, the time is for one reason.
Well, they can.
Again, you need a half day thing.
Well, then they can write about it. They can interview on it. They can put up a YouTube channel. The time problem is not as serious as you're saying it is, Dan. I don't think it is.
Well, in these settings that John's mostly focusing on.
Well, okay.
Right.
Then they can say, hey, just like anything else, I'm a university professor. We're going to get together and we're going to have a discussion for 50 minutes or whatever. Prior to you doing that, do 2 hours of homework. And these are the materials that I want you to look at. If they wanted to account for this time problem, they could do this.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so I'm just saying that it's not an impossible problem.
All right. Well, anyway, the aspect of pastoral that I wanted to emphasize, that I think it's a wonderful one, is to normalize the experience of what you're going through. I do think there's an affirmation that you have rights, that your family have rights to be upset, to be confused and stuff like this, but that our time together is going to be, as much as any content, me modeling for you that with time and the growth into new perspectives, these things don't have to still feel so threatening, so emotional to you and things like that. And, I don't have very many critiques of those guys doing those kinds of things. But you're right, maybe in their writings and things they have to do it, and that's when all the social capital and the job worries and all that come in.
Yeah, and if I were to get personal rather than academic in my critique, it's because these are the people that I ran with for several years. And then I became aware of legitimate critiques by people who are not academically credentialed, whether it's Brent Metcalf or Sandra Tanner or Tom Phillips or whoever, and felt like, wait a minute, my academic colleagues have been downplaying these things systematically in the academic conferences that they hold, in the things that they publish with university presses, in the podcast interviews they give, in the conversations I've had. And so I felt,
and in the books they write,
and I felt like, okay, there is this complaint about traditional apologists, that people who have concerns with the faith, they go on to FAIR or to wherever to get answers to these questions, and then they are more disturbed by the answers that they find than than anything else. And that was exactly, well, because I never really was deeply entrenched with the more traditional approach, the more farms or interpreter approach. I was never entrenched in that. I was hired at the Maxwell Institute after the things went down with Dan Peterson, getting fired or whatever. And so I was never entrenched in that. And so for me, it felt like a very deep betrayal to come to a point where I thought, wait a minute, there are things that are not openly addressed in the scholarly literature that deserve to be. And there are people who are addressing these things but are discounted. They're belittled because they do not have academic credentials. And so, and I'll give you one example. I was deeply disturbed by several things that Greg Prince says in his book, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, particularly about women's issues, okay? And how the Relief Society used to basically be autonomous, and then it was subjugated to the priesthood hierarchy as one result of correlation in the 60s or whenever that was. And so when I'm out of the church, and a friend of mine, an active LDS professor, invited me to his home to speak about it, issues as to why I would stop going to church. And I didn't bring up a ton of things, but one of the things I brought up was Greg Prince's book. And my friend, my mentor in many ways, basically told me why I don't need to worry about Greg Prince's book. And part of it is because Greg Prince is the most arrogant man he's ever met. Part of it is because Greg Prince is not a historian. Part of it is this, that, or whatever. And so at the same time, he felt like he was addressing my concerns by trying to legitimate the source of my concerns. I felt like he was ignoring my concerns and therefore reinforcing them. If that makes any sense, the story I'm telling.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and ad hominem and any of this stuff is absolutely, their credentialism and all those kinds of things are absolutely at play here.
And he didn't do it publicly, and so I'm not going to claim, and this is why I'm not speaking about I'm not saying his name publicly, of course not, but to me, this was just my thought process as I was sitting there. I was like, this is more evidence of my concern, and so.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to defend any of the people that you said was disappointing, but the realities of what buildings are you holding your conferences in, who's funding it, who's paying for the people to come in, who is your audience, all those kinds of things play in a consideration of somebody's colleagues at the Matthews Well Institute, not having the types of conferences that we would dream to have these people be at, but
which is why I say that the people who are part of the professional defense, intellectual defense of Mormonism, even if they don't work at BYU, their social capital plummets if they were to speak in a certain way. In other words, they would stop being invited to conferences, and they would stop being invited to contribute to essay collections. They would be not. It wouldn't be because anybody dislikes them individually, but it's because the way that things are set up systematically that they would become iced out. They'd be squeezed out. And I think that that's a real tragedy, because it fosters a kind of groupthink that's not good for intellectual conversation. And it also, and this is just a part of reality, I recognize this, it's not an LDS problem, it's an academic problem generally, but it reinforces the fact that the people who get to keep the jobs and get the publications are the ones that are willing to say things that do not rock the boat of the donor class, whether that donor is an institution or a wealthy individual or whatever. And I think part of the reason that Greg Prince is able to write what he writes is because he is independently wealthy.
Right.
And I think that is a great thing for him to be able to speak to the facts and to the data as clearly as he knows how to. I think it speaks volumes for the strength of the contribution of his scholarship. And so to me, it's just a sad thing to contemplate that there are people publishing things because they need to pay off their student debt. And I'm not saying that's why they're doing it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it is a piece of the equation. And it's just and it is a piece of the equation that is never disclosed to the people who are hearing the voices of these individuals. It is never explained that this is how it works. And I think that they deserve to understand that. Now, it's complicated. It would take time to explain, but they're more than capable of understanding this feature of the whole puzzle. So.
Well, I think Bert makes an excellent point there. This was a concern I had when I was at Claremont, when we were kind of getting this Mormon studies program there going, was, hey, if we have a conference, I know there was never any donor that said, hey, you cannot have this person speak. Right? That never happened. But I guarantee you, whether at Claremont, whether at Virginia, whether at Utah State, UVU, any of these schools doing it, and I've seen it in multiple schools, where a concern they have in their back of their mind is, if we invite this person to speak, if this person speaks on this topic, will that affect donors? Will that affect the board? Will that affect, all these sorts of things? So there always is. And the board, donors, all those sorts of things always, right? It largely points back to the institutional church. It also works the other way around, right? There's also the concern of, if we have somebody speak on this, will our faculty, right? Will our faculty not like somebody who believes that the Book of Mormon is historical, talking, expressing that point of view, right? So those tensions come from both ways, and it's a difficult position to have to balance.
And I want to be very clear that this is not something unique. This is not a problem unique to Latter-day Saints in academia. It's a broad problem. And looking at cases like whether it's Norman Finkelstein or David Graeber, or recently Brett Weinstein has been in the news a lot. I mean, this is a serious problem about how academia functions, and it's not something specific to Latter-day Saints. However, it is present among Latter-day Saints, and it's something that needs to be understood and disclosed, I think. So.
Wonderful. I love the reason for these podcasts. In some ways, we're able to articulate these many layers. So I'm grateful for these forums. John, I don't know. I don't even know about you guys. Are you guys able to stay a little bit longer, or how are we going to wrap this up without getting ridiculous?
More I think
than we are
in a couple minutes.
Got to go sell a house, man.
I think we can all maybe we can all just kind of summarize our thoughts or some final points. Just kind of go around the horn a little bit.
Yeah. I because I need to go quickly, if I could, a couple brief thoughts is, number one, every single person that I criticize, I hope that I criticize at the level of their work, and I do not criticize them as individuals, because I have interacted with a fair number of them and have liked every single one of them. Now, I don't know if that's reciprocal. I understand that they're a little nicer to like than I am sometimes, but that's something I would say. The other thing I would say is that there is a huge contingency of people writing that are very interesting, that are very honest, that say things that are very good and supportive. And I just thought I would list a few names in case there are people that want to follow up on any of them. I've mentioned some during this podcast, so I won't repeat any, but I really like Will Van Wagenen. I like Sam Young, J. Nelson Seawright, and not only Josh Madsen, but his father, Ron, as well. Dennis Potter, I think, is a philosopher at BYU.
Kelly D. Potter. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
She's transitioned.
And Darren Smith, a lot of people that have been on Mormon Stories, and then historical people like Sterling McMurrin, but also John Charles Duffy, Thomas McConkie. I mentioned you, Dan, and Loyd, and Gina, of course. But there are people like John Larson that I think need to be very seriously engaged, and he's completely left out of academic conversations, but poets as well, not just scholars. Alex Caldiero, Kimberly Johnson, Timothy Liu, John Williams at Yale is a great lyricist with the band Faded Paper Figures, John Sterling Harris. I think there are a lot of people that just do not get included in mainstream conversations about these sort of things, but are fabulous individuals that have very important things to say about the Mormon religious experience that can and ought to be incorporated into what we have to do. Unfortunately, I have to leave, but thank you for letting me be on the podcast. And
hey, well, you're one of those voices, brother. Good. Great to have you.
All right,
Bert, there's a lot of comments from the listeners saying how much they loved your participation. So let's have you back on Mormon Stories.
Okay, thank you, John. Take care, both of you.
Thanks, friend.
Bert.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Loyd, do you want to go? Final thoughts or whatever?
I think my final thoughts go back to where I started with Julian Reynolds' chapter, and that's that I think we have to – it becomes so easy to talk about apologetics, again, as men fighting over, trying to beat – apologetics and critics just – engaging each other as, and on both ends, critics as well, as we characterize it as these intellectual battles of just trying to prove each other right or wrong and trying to win fights. But I think from both ends, we fail to recognize how much of these are an act of love, right? Whether it's an apologist who spends her time on a message board defending what means so much to her, or whether it's someone, quote unquote critic, I don't even like the term critic a lot, who gets on there and is trying to share their reasons for leaving because it's important to who they are. And I think sometimes we miss out on how much love is involved in these things. And, of course I stand by my argument, but at the same time I recognize that a lot of people who are engaged in apologetics do so because of love, because it's something they're defending something that's brought a lot of meaning, importance, and value to their lives. So, and I think it's always important for all of us on all ends to recognize that, to try to view each other in the best faith possible. So recently, my chapter is reviewed in Interpreter, and the reviewer immediately begins the lines, Loyd Ericson attacks apologetics, right? Which immediately frames the discussion, not in terms of debate or discussion, but in terms of violence. And I think we so often, and I probably engaged in this discussion here, we so often view each other in the worst light possible. And I think a lot of benefit would happen if we recognize that that's what we do.
Thank you, brother. It's so interesting that, when you plan out a podcast and what we're going to cover and what we're going to do, it never happens. And one of the things we certainly planned was to do more celebration of this book. It really is one of the most important and interesting books that I've read in a long time. And I really credit to you and Blair and Coford Books for letting voices speak for themselves. That's what's so beautiful in here. You got Dan Peterson and Ralph Hancock especially unleashed, and for someone like me, in many ways, those are self-defeating or self-refuting, but they're here. And when you celebrate Julianne Reynolds in here, and I'm going, that is interesting, because she's including mommy bloggers and others, as apologists. And I'm thinking about the different things, but, she's a co-founder of FAIR, and you have them all here along with you and others who are criticizing the apologetic enterprise. And there's just all sorts of discussions in here. And then towards the end, very personal voices with both David Bacavoy and you mentioned Seth Payne. So
the best way to celebrate that book is everybody should go out and buy 5 copies.
Woohoo!
So I can take out Angela on a date one of these nights.
Nice. Well, dude, I just wanted to celebrate that, and I loved the idea that this is out of luck. When I get on these podcasts, John and Loyd, it seems like so much of my activity here is countering extreme language. It's something that felt like it was at this pole, so I naturally almost polarize and try to bring some sort of balance in it. And I just wanted to share with listeners, if we were to sit down and chat and just do this, I absolutely love and willing to talk about every one of these difficult issues that we've been raising, and I think John makes wonderful points and things like that about experience and also. So I don't want to ever make it sound like, oh, he's defending. I'm mostly countering extreme or slightly accusatory or just not thinking the best, like Loyd was just talking about, those kinds of things. The NeoApologists, I happen to know pretty much everyone quite well who has been sort of put in this group. And honestly, in person, you would really enjoy these people, and you would see, I'm not going to say that they're not telling the truth in what they say, just like on my podcast, I believe everything I say, but I am, and I admit that I am, I'm putting myself forward how I feel on a good day and not a bad day, or not after I just read a particular piece or something like that. And so these people have great depth that we're kind of putting in this category. And they're fun and funny, and we all just roll our eyes at various things and whatnot. So I just want to humanize them. But even as I say, they have every right to be strategic, to think about all the worries that Bert has, that Bert helped us articulate today about jobs and reputation, and being strategic and, thinking through a plan on a long-term thing. Those are not things that I'm really quick to criticize. So I have loved this, John, and I still hope we'll do a third one. And I really want to have some women guests and some people from this volume. And again, congratulations on the volume, and thanks for those. It looks like we've had really 60 to 100 people pretty much tuned in, and I don't know how many of them are, coming and going or whatnot, but thank you for your stamina, and I hope this has been a rich experience.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll just say, again, I also agree that folks should go out and buy 1 to 5 copies of this book. It's definitely a worthy read. Loyd, I want to just give a shout out to Coford Books and to you and to the good people at Coford. What you guys do is hard, and I think what you do is important. And I think it deserves credit and attention. And because I'm sure you could make a lot more money doing other things. I'm sure Greg Coford is not getting rich off of Coford Books. I'm sure he could invest that money in other ways and probably make a lot more. And so I do think what you guys do is an act of love. It's probably thankless work many times. It's probably ignored far too often than it should be. And so I wanted to start by, number one, thanking you for your work, thanking you and Coford Books for what you do, thanking you for your willingness to come on the podcast. Even though you and I have probably disagreed or felt passionately in different ways, I appreciate you willing to dialogue and to come back on. So thank you, Loyd.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll just end by agreeing with you, Loyd, and Dan and Bert. We need more light than heat. We need less extreme language. We need more understanding. We should have more compassion for all. And I love what you said, Loyd, about understanding that everybody's coming from a place of love and sincerity for the most part. And I really like that. I hope that today has at least chipped away a bit at some of the thoughts or concerns or opinions or biases that people have. And I hope we can have more and more of these types of conversations where we try and think more clearly. I'll just end by saying, I know Patrick Mason, Richard Bushman, Terrell Givens. I've met them. I've seen the work they do, and I have deep respect for what they do. And I think what they do is really hard. And I respect that what they do is nuanced and it's subtle and it requires political capital and it's sophisticated. So I don't mean to come off as a harsh critic of them. I just think that that there's a lot at stake in the decisions people make in their lives, and so we just have to keep doing the best that we can to get as reliable and as accurate information out there as we can, to make people as informed as we can, and to provide people with role models and opinions and perspectives that allow people as many options and possibilities as are viable. And that's why I'm a big supporter of Mormon Matters and A Thoughtful Faith and Coford Books, because they, even though those represent paths that are different from my own, I think people need lots of different role models and paths to choose from. And so I'm glad we're having these discussions. I hope that all these institutions keep thriving. And I just hope in the end, people have all the information they need and all the role models and all the paths necessary to be able to make decisions that are best for them. And ultimately, I don't care what decisions people make, as long as they're informed decisions and as long as they're decisions that lead to the optimal well-being for the individuals involved.
Nice.
So thanks to all of you for being a part of that.
Yeah. And let me add a thanks to the listeners who wrote comments. So I hope anybody who's listening to this will go to the Mormon Stories page and find this live feed and look through the comments section, because there was a lot of things there that I wish we could have gotten to. I know we had John shared something from Tracy Austin earlier today that I would have loved to play with a little bit more. My friend Matt wrote me, and I shared with John beforehand. I think we got to some of his issues tangentially, but it certainly wasn't our intent, everybody, to not be as engaged with your specific questions and comments as we did. And I think it will enhance anybody's listening pleasure to actually go to Facebook and find kind of the running comments. So just wanted to cheer for that.
Love it. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. And thanks to our listeners. Thank you, Dan. Shout out to Mormon Matters. Love all you listeners there. Please support Dan. Please donate to Mormon Matters because we need to pay Dan, and these podcasts have to be sustainable to be able to pay the podcast hosts. So donate to Mormon Matters. Donate to Mormon Stories. Buy lots of Koford books.
Nice.
There's a huge library. What's your website, Loyd?
GregKoford.com.
All right. And how else can people support Koford books, Loyd?
Buying multiple copies.
Okay.
You love a copy, buy a copy for your friends.
All right.
Have Koford authors on podcasts.
Yes, have Koford authors on podcasts. Come to our events when we have them. Subscribe to our newsletter at the bottom of GregKoford.com.
All right.
We try not to spam.
All right. Thanks, Loyd. Thanks, Dan. Love you guys. And thanks to all our listeners. Please tune in again for more Mormon Matters and more Mormon Stories. Take care, everybody.